The night air felt crisp on Abigail Thornton's face as she stepped onto the porch of her family's newly built cabin in the Nebraska Territory. It was the autumn of 1858, and at 16 years old, she had already traveled more miles than many. It would in a lifetime. The Thornton family had left their comfortable life in Pennsylvania 6 months ago, drawn by promises of fertile land and new beginnings. Her father, Thomas, a stern but fair-minded former schoolteacher, had declared that the expanding frontier was where their destiny lay. "Abby, come help with these dishes," her mother called from inside. Martha Thornton maintained the same standards of domestic order she had back east, despite the primitive conditions of their homestead. Abigail sighed, taking one last look at the darkening prairie that stretched endlessly before her. The tall grasses swayed like an ocean under the moonlight, beautiful and terrifying in their vastness. She had yet to make peace with this wild place, so different from the crowded streets and neat gardens of her childhood home. Inside the cabin, her younger brothers Daniel and Joshua were already asleep on their pallets near the fireplace. The journey west had transformed them from pampered town boys into sunburned little men who could identify animal tracks and help their father with the demanding work of establishing a homestead. "Do you think we'll have neighbors before winter?" Abigail asked as she dried the wooden plates her mother handed her. Martha tucked a stray lock of graying hair back under her cap. "Your father heard at the trading post that 2 more families are expected next month. Perhaps they'll have children your age." "Girls, I hope," Abigail murmured. She missed her friends, the shared secrets and laughter that had filled her days back in Pennsylvania. Here she had only her family and the occasional visits to the small settlement 15 miles away, where her father traded their extra crops for necessities. That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the cabin creak and moan like a living thing. She slipped from her bed, careful not to wake her mother who slept nearby, and moved to the small window. The moon illuminated the yard and the edge of the cornfield her father had planted. Something moved there, at the border where cultivation met wilderness. Abigail squinted, certain her eyes were playing tricks, but no, there was definitely a figure crouching by the edge of the field, not an animal, but a person. Her heart raced. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Could it be one of the Pawnee from the tribe that occasionally traded with settlers? Her father had established a cautious but respectful relationship with them, unlike some settlers who viewed all natives with suspicion and hostility. Curiosity overcame fear. Wrapping her shawl around her nightdress, Abigail silently lifted the latch on the back door and slipped outside. The cool grass tickled her bare feet as she moved toward the cornfield, staying in the shadows. As she approached, she saw it was a boy, perhaps no older than herself. His dark hair hung in long strands around a face streaked with dirt. He was thin, painfully so, and his breathing came in labored gasps. But what caught her attention most was the blood soaking through a crude bandage around his arm. The boy looked up, suddenly aware of her presence. Terror flashed in his eyes and he tried to rise, only to stumble back to his knees. "Wait," Abigail whispered, instinctively raising her hands to show she meant no harm. "You're hurt." He stared at her, poised between flight and collapse. Abigail took a cautious step forward. She had no idea if he understood English, but she continued speaking softly. "I can help you. My mother has medicines." She gestured toward his injured arm, then back to the cabin. After a moment's hesitation, the boy's shoulders slumped. Whatever circumstances had brought him here, whatever danger he was fleeing, exhaustion and pain had finally overcome him. Abigail helped him to the family's barn, knowing her father would never approve of bringing a stranger, especially a native boy, into their home without permission. She settled him on a bed of clean straw, then hurried back to the cabin to retrieve bandages, water, and some of her mother's herbal salve. "What's your name?" she asked as she cleaned his wound. a deep gash that looked like it had been made by a knife or sharp tool. The boy watched her warily. "Kichizi," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "Kichizi," she repeated, the unfamiliar name awkward on her tongue. "I'm Abigail." He nodded slightly, then winced. As she applied the salve, "Sorry," she murmured. "This will help prevent the wound from festering." As she worked, Abigail noticed other injuries. Bruises on his face and neck, raw marks on his wrists, as if he'd been bound. Whatever had happened to him, it hadn't been an accident. "Are people looking for you?" she asked, wrapping a clean strip of cloth around his arm. His dark eyes met hers. White men, soldiers. Abigail felt a chill. Relations between settlers and the indigenous tribes were tense. The government's policies of removal and confinement had led to conflict and bloodshed across the territories. Her own father spoke against such policies, believing in the possibility of peaceful coexistence. But his was a minority view. "Why are they after you?" Kichizi closed his eyes briefly. "They took our children to school far away. I escaped." Abigail had heard of such schools, where native children were sent to be civilized, forced to speak English, wear Western clothes, and abandon their heritage. Her teacher in Pennsylvania had described them as benevolent, institutions bringing education and Christianity to savage children. But the raw pain in Kichizi's voice told a different story. "I'll bring you food," she promised, rising to her feet. "Stay hidden if my father finds you." She didn't finish the sentence. Thomas Thornton was a fair man, but harboring a fugitive, especially one being pursued by government authorities, would put their entire family at risk. For the next 3 days, Abigail brought Kichizi food and fresh water, changing his bandages and listening as his strength returned, and with it his story. He was Pawnee, from a band that had been forced onto a reservation the previous year. The soldiers had come and taken several children, including his younger sister, to a school hundreds of miles away. Kichizi had been among them, but had escaped during the journey. Now he was trying to return to what remained of his tribe to tell them what had happened. On the 4th morning, Abigail approached the barn with a bundle of food and a terrible sense of dread. Her father had mentioned at breakfast that a military patrol was in the area, searching for an Indian boy who had assaulted a government agent and escaped custody. The barn door was ajar. Inside, Kichizi was already on his feet, a makeshift pack slung over his shoulder. "You've heard," he said, noting her expression. Abigail nodded. "They'll be here by midday. My father won't lie to them if they ask questions. I must go now." His English had improved with each conversation they'd shared. "Where will you go?" "The prairie offers little shelter, and they have horses." Kichizi pointed west. "There are places to hide if you know them. Caves, dense woods along the river." Abigail bit her lip, torn between concern for his safety and awareness of the danger his presence posed to her family. "Now wait until nightfall. I'll bring you more food and a proper canteen for water." That night, with her family asleep, Abigail met Kichizi at the edge of the property. She had filled a canvas sack with cornbread, dried meat, and a small jar of honey, luxury items her mother had been saving. She'd also taken her father's spare hunting knife, knowing he would notice its absence but unable to send Kichizi into the wilderness unarmed. "The soldiers came," she told him. "They asked if we'd seen any natives in the area. Father said no, which was true. He hasn't seen you." Relief flickered across Kichizi's face. "They're camped at the crossroads, about 5 miles east," Abigail continued. "You should head west as you planned, but stay away from the main trails." Kichizi accepted the provisions with solemn dignity. "Why do you help me? Your people and mine are just people," Abigail finished for him. "My father taught me to judge individuals by their character, not by where they were born or the color of their skin." "Your father is wise, but rare among settlers. Yes, she admitted, but perhaps not as rare as you think. There are many who question the government's policies, who believe the native peoples have been treated unjustly. Kichizi studied her face in the moonlight. Yes, I will remember you, Abigail Thornton, and your kindness. With that, he turned and disappeared into the tall grasses of the prairie. Abigail stood watching long after he had vanished from sight, feeling as though something significant had shifted in her understanding of the world. The next morning, Abigail's father confronted her about the missing knife. His voice was stern, but his eyes held a question beyond the obvious one. I lost it while gathering berries by the creek, she lied, avoiding his gaze. Thomas Thornton studied his daughter's face. Be Abigail, is there something you need to tell me? For a moment, she considered confessing everything, about Kichizi, about the schools taking native children, about the soldiers hunting a boy whose only crime was wanting to return to his family. But fear kept her silent. Not fear for herself, but for Kichizi and for her father, who could face serious consequences for harboring a fugitive, however briefly. No, father, she said finally. I'm sorry about the knife. Thomas sighed. Very well, but remember, Abigail, this frontier demands honesty and trust between family members. Our survival depends on it. The guilt of her deception weighed heavily as Abigail went about her chores that day. By afternoon, word reached them that the military patrol had moved on, continuing their search westward. Abigail prayed that Kichizi had found safe hiding. 2 weeks passed. The Thornton family was busy with harvest and preparations for winter. Abigail tried to focus on her responsibilities, but her thoughts often drifted to Kichizi, wondering if he had reached his people or if the soldiers had captured him. Then came the day of the first snowfall. Abigail was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she noticed fresh footprints leading from the woods to the barn. Her heart quickened. The prints were too small to be her father's or any adult. In the barn, she found not Kichizi, but a young girl huddled in the same corner where he had recovered. The child couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. Her hair had been cut short in the fashion of the government schools, but her dark eyes held the same determined spirit she had seen in Kichizi. Who are you? Abigail asked gently, kneeling before the girl. The child regarded her warily, clutching a small beaded pouch to her chest. Nisha, she finally whispered. Recognition dawned on Abigail. You're Kichizi's sister. The girl's eyes widened at her brother's name. She nodded vigorously. Did he send you here? Is he nearby? Nisha shook her head. In halting English, she explained that she had escaped from the school during a measles outbreak that had thrown the institution into chaos. Remembering her brother's stories about a kind settler girl, she had made her way to the Thornton homestead, following landmarks Kichizi had described to other children from their tribe. How long have you been traveling? Abigail asked, noting the girl's chapped lips and dirty face. Many days, Nisha replied, holding up both hands with fingers spread to indicate 10 or more. Abigail's mind raced. This complicated matters significantly. Hiding a recovering boy for a few days was one thing, concealing a young child for an extended period was quite another. But the thought of turning Nisha away, of abandoning her, to certain recapture or death from exposure in the approaching winter, was unthinkable. Wait here, she told Nisha. I'll bring you food and warm clothes. Then we must talk to my father. The girl's face crumpled in fear. No. White. Father will send Nisha back to school. My father is a good man, Abigail insisted, though uncertainty gnawed at her. Thomas Thornton might be more enlightened than many settlers, but he was still a law-abiding citizen who had always taught his children to respect authority. Would he see sheltering Nisha as a moral imperative or as a dangerous act of defiance? Against the government, Returning to the cabin, Abigail found her father alone, reading by the fire while her mother and brothers were visiting neighbors several miles away. "Father," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to show you something in the barn." Thomas looked up from his book, his expression curious rather than suspicious. "What is it, Abby?" "It's better if you see for yourself." As they crossed the yard to the barn, Abigail's mind whirled with possible arguments, with pleas for compassion and appeals to her father's sense of justice. But when Thomas Thornton saw the small, frightened child huddled in the straw, something in his face softened. "Who is this?" he asked quietly. "Her name is Nisha. She escaped from one of those schools where they send native children. And she's been traveling alone for days." Thomas knelt before the girl, his movements deliberately slow and gentle. "Hello, Nisha. Are you hungry?" The girl nodded cautiously. "Abigail, go to the house and bring some of the stew your mother left for supper. And a blanket." His voice was calm, betraying none of the thoughts surely racing behind his. Steady gaze. Once Nisha had eaten and was wrapped in a warm blanket, Thomas turned to his daughter. "Now, Abigail, I think it's time you told me the full story, and no more tales about lost knives." So Abigail confessed everything about finding Kichizi, treating his wounds, helping him escape the soldiers. As she spoke, she watched her father's face, trying to gauge his reaction. His expression remained unreadable. "I know I should have told you," she finished. "But I was afraid you would feel obligated to report him to the authorities." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from his daughter to the native child who had fallen asleep, exhausted, against the barn wall. "The law says this child should be returned to the school," he said finally. "The law says she's a ward of the government, that education will civilize her and give her a better future than the one she was born to." Abigail's heart sank. "Father, please." He held up a hand to silence her. "But what I've seen of these policies, the broken treaties, the forced relocations, the children torn from their families, it troubles my conscience deeply." Hope flickered in Abigail's chest. "Then you won't turn her in?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "I will not be party to such injustice, but harboring her here is too dangerous, for her and for us. The military patrols this area regularly, and neighbors visit without warning." "Yes, what can we do then?" "There's a settlement of Quakers about 70 miles north of here. They operate a kind of underground network, helping native people escape the reservations and the government schools. They could get Nisha safely to her people." Abigail stared at her father in astonishment. "How do you know about this?" A faint smile crossed Thomas's face. "Did you think you were the only one in this family with secrets, Abby?" "I've been corresponding with a Quaker friend from Pennsylvania who moved to the territory specifically to assist the native tribes. I've been considering offering our homestead as a stopping point on their route." "You never said anything." "It's dangerous work. I wanted to protect you and your mother, your brothers. But now—" He glanced at the sleeping child. "Now I see that sometimes protection means taking risks for what's right." The next morning, Thomas announced to the family that he needed to make an urgent trip to trade for winter supplies. He would be gone for several days. Martha questioned the timing, with snow already falling intermittently and more predicted, but ultimately trusted her husband's judgment. Abigail knew the true purpose of his journey: to take Nisha to the Quaker settlement. Thomas had decided it was safer to travel alone with the child than to risk involving the entire family. As father and daughter prepared the wagon before dawn, Abigail asked, "Will you tell Mother the truth when you return?" Thomas secured a tarp over the supplies that would conceal Nisha during the journey. "Yes, your mother has her own strong sense of justice. She may be angry that I kept this from her, but she'll understand why it was necessary." Abigail helped Nisha into the hidden compartment they had created among the supply crates. The girl seemed calmer today, more trusting after a night of safety and a warm breakfast. "You're going to people who will help you find your brother and your tribe," Abigail explained, tucking an extra blanket around the child. "My father will protect you on the journey." Nisha grasped Abigail's hand. "You are Kidapo," she said solemnly. "Friend." Thomas and Nisha departed in the grey light of early morning. Abigail stood watching until the wagon disappeared from sight, feeling both apprehension and a strange sense of pride. Her small act of kindness toward Kichizi had set in motion something larger than herself, a choice to stand against injustice, even at personal risk. The days of Thomas's absence were tense. A fresh snowstorm blew in, and Martha voiced increasing concern about her husband's safety. Abigail tried to reassure her mother while battling her own fears. Had they been stopped by soldiers? Had Nisha been discovered? Or worse, had they been caught in the storm with inadequate shelter? On the sixth day, when the family had begun to discuss sending neighbors to search, Thomas Thornton returned. He was exhausted, his face windburned, and his clothes travel-worn, but his eyes held a quiet satisfaction that told Abigail all she needed to know. That night, after the boys were asleep, Thomas told Martha everything about Nisha, about the Quaker settlement, about his growing conviction that they must take a more active role in helping those victimized by the government's policies. Martha was silent for a long time after he finished speaking. Finally, she said, "All these years I've followed you, Thomas, from our comfortable home in Pennsylvania to this wild place. I've never questioned your decisions because I trusted your judgment." She reached for his hand. "I trust it still. If this is the path you believe is right, then it's our path as a family." Over the following months, the Thornton homestead became a link in the underground network, helping Native people, mostly children and women, escape from government institutions and find their way back to their tribes or to settlements in Canada where they could live in relative freedom. The work was dangerous and had to be conducted in absolute secrecy. Abigail learned to watch for signals from passing traders that indicated someone would need shelter, to prepare hidden compartments in wagons and beneath floorboards, to communicate using coded language when strangers were present. Spring brought news via the Quaker network. Nisha had been reunited with her brother, Kichizi. They were living with a mixed band of Pawnee and other tribes that had established a hidden community near the Canadian border, beyond the reach of American authorities. With the message came a small token, a beautifully beaded bracelet in blue and white, Abigail's favorite colors. She wore it hidden beneath her sleeve, a constant reminder of the boy whose courage had changed her understanding of justice and of her own capacity to effect change. As settlers continued to pour into the territory, the Thorntons maintained their public image as a hard-working pioneer family while secretly continuing their dangerous work. Abigail, once a shy and somewhat sheltered girl, grew into a young woman of quiet strength and conviction. The frontier that had initially terrified her had become the landscape of her purpose, not just a place to build a new life for her family, but a battleground where the rights and dignity of all people, regardless of origin, must be defended. Years later, long after the events that had shaped her youth, Abigail would write in her journal, "The true pioneers are not those who merely claim land and build structures upon it, but those who forge new paths of understanding between the peoples." The frontier that matters most is not the physical boundary between civilization and wilderness, but the moral territory where we must choose daily between comfortable compliance with injustice and the harder road of standing for what is right. And whatever the cost, the friendship between a settler girl and a native boy, brief as their actual time together had been, had indeed redefined what the frontier meant for one family, creating a legacy of courage and compassion that would continue long after the physical borders of the American West had been closed, and somewhere to the north, beyond the reach of those who would deny him his heritage and freedom, Kichizi carried his own memories of the girl who had tended his wounds and risked her safety to help him. Proof that even in times of greatest division, human connection could transcend the artificial boundaries created by governments and prejudice. In the years that followed, the Thornton homestead prospered. Thomas's careful farming practices yielded abundant harvests, and the family became respected members of the growing community. Yet they never abandoned their secret work, helping dozens of native people escape oppression and find their way to freedom. Abigail eventually married a young doctor who had come west to establish a practice in the newly formed town nearby. David Miller shared the Thorntons' convictions about justice for the indigenous peoples, having witnessed firsthand the devastating health conditions on reservations during his medical training. Together, they continued the work Abigail's family had begun, using David's medical travels as cover for transporting fugitives. The bracelet Kichizi's sister had sent remained Abigail's talisman, a reminder of the moment when she had chosen courage over fear, compassion over compliance. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the prairie wind blew from the north, she would touch the beaded band and wonder about the boy whose brief presence in her life had altered its course so profoundly. She never saw Kichizi again, but his influence remained in the choices she made, in the children she raised to value justice above convenience, in the quiet revolution she helped sustain against policies designed to erase entire cultures from the American landscape. This was the true pioneering of the American West, not just the settlement of land, but the ongoing struggle to create a society where all could live with dignity and freedom. It was a struggle that continued long after the frontier was declared. Closed, carried forward by those like Abigail, who had learned that true courage often lay in challenging the very systems one had been raised to accept without question. And in a hidden community far to the north, Kichizi kept his own memories of the girl who had shown him that humanity could transcend the divisions of race and politics, a lesson that sustained him through years of struggle and eventual triumph. As his people found ways to preserve their culture despite all efforts to extinguish it, two lives briefly intersected, creating ripples that would influence generations to come. This was the real story of the American frontier, told not in official histories, but in the quiet actions of those who chose to stand for what was right when doing so carried the greatest risk.